On Primetime Politics, turning Liberal fortunes.
Pierre Poilievre has made it clear that he would make cuts to all these investments.
A new ad campaign is launched by the governing party, but will it turn terrible polling numbers around? Will it silence critics within caucus who think Justin Trudeau does not have what's needed to win another mandate? We'll speak with our Ottawa bureau chiefs. Also,
you know, when the guns are trained on her face.
Donald Trump makes a violent comment involving one of his biggest critics. Coming up, we'll examine the impact of his words with just days left in the U.S. campaign. And the polls say Tuesday's American vote is still a toss-up, but how reliable are those numbers? We will take a look. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. A new ad campaign is being rolled out by the Liberal Party, said to be part of a larger campaign to make up lost ground to the Conservatives. The first of the ads was released on Thursday, with a second ad following on Friday.
The Liberal team is fighting for you to build more homes and protect renters, to deliver dental care and free contraceptives and diabetes medications, to keep guns out of our communities, to make life more affordable with $10 a day childcare and the Canada Child Benefit, and to create new, well-paying jobs and build a thriving economy that works for everyone. That's real progress.
But will this new campaign be enough to turn public opinion? Will they be enough to end doubt in the Prime Minister's leadership? To talk about this, we're now joined by Robert Fife, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, Tonda MacCharles, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Joël-Denis Bellavance, Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse. Hello to the three of you.
Hello.
Hello. Okay, well, let's start there, and let's actually begin in caucus. When you see this campaign, because the Prime Minister was being criticized for not doing enough to respond to really horrible polling numbers, is this enough to quell the dissension or the critics within his own caucus, Bob?
I don't think it is. I mean, look, you still have a lot of people who feel that no matter what the Liberals do, they're not going to be able to overcome the Conservatives as long as Mr. Trudeau is the leader of the party, and that's simply because of leadership fatigue. But, you know, what the Liberals are trying to do is what they have been doing under Paul Martin, under Jean Chrétien, and under Pierre Elliott Trudeau when it comes to Conservatives. They haul out health care, that this is going to be taken away, and this week we're hearing nothing but abortion now. The only thing that's interesting, it just shows you how tired this government is. It didn't show it in that clip that you did, but one of the ads says we're not going back, which was
the first ad that was released on the Thursday.
Come on. I mean, are you that tired that you can't think of something better than what the Democrats are doing south of the border?
Yeah, it seemed a bit derivative when you heard that line. What do you make of it? Is it, again, the criticism is the Prime Minister and his team not doing enough to get out there in front of Canadians? Is this the start of something that will quell the rebellion?
I think that those who believe that their misfortunes are due to Mr. Trudeau being at the top will not be satisfied simply by the rollout of some ads. I think that they figure they've got a much tougher hill to climb than just that. So it might not be the answer, but it might be enough perhaps to motivate some of the others, the supporters of Trudeau, to sort of not question any longer what's going on and to sort of commit and work on, you know, the re-election effort. But no, it's long overdue, and you know, the Liberals have a lot more to worry about, right? They have to worry about the polling. They have to worry about how they're going to win in targeted seats. How are they going to fundraise? Now, the fundraising numbers that we saw this week showed that they, to my surprise, actually, I thought they would have shown a much steeper drop for the Liberals. In fact, they're doing as well as they did last year anyway, so even post those two by-election losses, still okay. But they're being way out fundraised by the Conservatives, who are basically making double all the parties combined. So that's a big hill for any party to get over.
Joël-Denis?
Well, this might be too little, too late, because some of the MPs who were demanding Mr. Trudeau's leave, they were demanding that kind of ad and activity 2 years ago. And they were also specifically demanding that the party aim their attack at Mr. Poilievre, and that they try to define him before he was defining himself in front of the Canadian population. So to me, it might be a little bit too little, too late to reverse the trend that we have seen over the last 18 months, which definitely favor the Conservative Party. And as Bob mentioned, I think there's huge leadership fatigue. We say in French, l'usure du pouvoir, which I like a lot because it's as long as you use power, people become fatigued with your decision. We've reached that point, and this is really hard to turn around for any prime minister.
And remember that this has been actually a very good week for Pierre Poilievre, maybe not around Parliament Hill, but out in the rest of the country by promising to get rid of the sales tax on new homes is something that's going to have
under $1 million.
Under $1 million. It's targeted to younger families, younger voters, which is what they have been going after for a considerable period of time. That is the kind of thing that sticks with people, not whether Parliament being paralyzed or whether, the Tories or the threats to abortion, which is not a threat at all because he's been very clear we're not going to do anything on that. That kind of comes across, I think, to a lot of Canadians as hot air, but you put something on the table that actually is going to have an impact on your life. That I think at the end of the week the Conservatives will probably ended up in a stronger position.
Well, and to the Conservatives, happiness, the housing advocates are applauding this move in terms of jump-starting people buying homes and even building homes. And it was interesting because when Pierre Poilievre asked the Prime Minister about this policy, said, will you adopt this policy, abandon the rest? The Prime Minister tried to change the channel. Instead of answering that question directly, he went to, well, will you get security clearance, which is threatening all Canadians if you're not on top of foreign interference. Talk to us about the change of the channel there. It's almost like a back way of admitting, yeah, that was a good policy. I'm trying to find something else.
On Monday morning when the Conservatives rolled it out, I thought that's the perfect kind of policy for the Liberals to steal, which is one of the reasons why the Conservatives have been reticent about rolling out a lot of policy. They don't want ideas stolen before the election, and they think that the idea is to roll it out in a campaign or just before. So how successful was it in changing the channel? I think there still do remain a lot of questions around the security clearance and what Mr. Poilievre does or doesn't have access to, and what he should or shouldn't have access to, and how he should action that intelligence if he gets it. But it's not the kind of thing I think that resonates far beyond the Hill. A lot of us here are very interested in it. The politicians are interested in it. But I think the bread and butter issues are the things that grab voters' attention. But I don't think the security clearance story is dead or over. I think there is still lots of questions around that.
Yeah. Mr. Trudeau was not alone in raising that issue. Every minister that stood up after Mr. Trudeau, after he first said it on Wednesday, on Thursday and on Friday, he raised and questioned why Mr. Poilievre was not getting his security clearance.
So does the Bloc and so does the NDP, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They all question it.
And to your point,
significantly, the Indo-Canadian community.
Yeah.
The two major Sikh groups were at a committee last night, and they are also saying, look, this is willful blindness not to want to know who in your party might be susceptible to whether it's Indian or Chinese foreign interference, particularly because we know from the report of a special group of parliamentarians that they allege that India had helped fund one of the leadership candidates. We don't know whether it was Mr. Poilievre or who it was. And those communities are really important because they're concentrated and can vote in a block, and that can make a big difference to a number of ridings. So I still, myself, I don't understand why Mr. Poilievre just doesn't go and have a security clearance.
Well, I think what was really interesting around this is we heard Michael Chong actually publicly say that they're afraid the Liberals will weaponize whatever they learn about Poilievre or whatever the government or the security apparatus learns about him. Right? He backtracked on it, but it was out there. He said
it. The Liberals are trying to make hay out of that too, right? By suggesting there's something he's trying to hide.
They had the ring of truth.
Well,
it had the ring of truth that they fear that somehow the Liberals would make hay with it.
For one reason, we saw how Trudeau used his final appearance at the Public Interference Commission to say, I would never use intelligence against a political opponent. Oh, but by the way, I have credible intelligence that the Conservatives are involved.
And what weakens Mr. Poilievre's case in this file is the fact that Yves-François Blanchet, a separatist leader, got his a security clearance. It was accepted recently, and he will go and see those documents that Mr. Poilievre doesn't want to see. So, to me, it adds the pressure, the fact that Mr. Blanchet just said that, yes, I got...
And there is another way for the government to provide the names to Mr. Poilievre rather than a security clearance.
Which the Prime Minister said he's trying to get advice on as to how he might do that.
What is called a threat reduction measure, which CSIS is allowed to be able to tell people, in this particular instance, we are concerned about specific threats to your party from some of these people members who may potentially be wittingly helping a foreign government. They can tell them that.
But CSIS said this week also at committee that is not the preferred
one, absolutely.
method, that they would be able to be more open with a party leader who has the full clearance.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, how are we mere mortals to judge all of this? It seems it's a...
But to me, this would probably be one of the issues debated during the election campaign if M. Poilievre does not decide to get his security
Well, again,
clearance.
you know, interestingly, Pierre Poilievre, the Conservatives have a good week with the housing announcement, the Trudeau government trying to change the channel with security. And they probably won't change the channel next week because it's the U.S. election. That'll take a lot of the auction out of the room, but afterwards we'll see what type of legs it has. Yeah. But, you know, speaking of the U.S. election, before we're done, I do want to get some comment here because Kelly Craft is a former ambassador to Canada from the United States, Donald Trump's appointee. And while she was in Ottawa in a public policy forum, she was talking about how if Trump is elected, Canadians better pony up cash because he's going to want to see more movement, a faster timeline on NATO commitments, as well as Arctic defense. We've heard the government talk about being ready at the trade front. Is it ready on the defense front to take on that type of criticism if Donald Trump wins?
Well, I don't think it's just going to be Donald Trump. I mean, the Biden administration has also been saying that. So was Obama. And frankly, there isn't any more patience for this government. Not to put more money into national defense, but also into the Arctic. So if it is Donald Trump, I think for sure we're going to have to, because you never know what the guy's going to do. So we probably are going to have to put more money down. But I think we'd have to do this whoever is elected, because the Americans are really pushing Canada, all of our allies, frankly.
It's a bipartisan issue down south of the border, and it should be a commitment up here because under Harper, we committed to the 2%, but Mr. Poilievre has not committed to that, spending that amount. So it's a challenge for Canada as a whole, whoever comes into power in the next election here, because below the border, both parties want us to up our game.
Yeah. It's interesting because the the directeur parlementaire du budget, the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, released a report this week showing that you would have to double spending on defense to reach the commitment that Mr. Trudeau made in Washington at the NATO summit in July. Now,
which is a timeline many years down the road.
Exactly, it's years down the road, but it's still doubling the spending in military in 8 years is a big task, and it just shows that any government that will be in power in the coming years will have very difficult budget decisions to make because it's a big chunk of money going from $41 billion this year to $82 billion in 8 years. It's a big jump in investing. And where do we find that money when you have a deficit?
Something's going to have to be cut.
Yeah, where do you find that money?
Or go into deep deficit spending.
You do have a deficit right now.
Or taxes.
Yeah, so difficult choices ahead to fulfill that commitment.
Remember when we were talking about surpluses? Remember those days?
Long gone.
Long gone. Okay. Bob, Tonda, Joël-Denis, thank you very much.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Well, to the U.S. election now, where the Trump team began this last weekend of campaigning, defending their candidate and condemning media coverage of a comment made by Donald Trump on the last day of October.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face.
Now, Democrats have condemned the comment for using violent rhetoric, which Republicans say it was not. And for more, we're now joined by Luiza Savage, executive editor of Growth with Politico. Luiza, hello to you.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
I'm good. So listen, you know, people keep talking about October surprises. This comment comes on the last day of October. I'm wondering about reaction to it. What are you hearing?
Well, you know, this is the moment where the candidates are trying to be making their final closing arguments to the voters. And the Trump campaign has just spent millions of dollars on ads that are focused on the economy and on the southern border, and saying that the Biden-Harris administration broke it and Trump could fix it. That's the message they're trying to focus on. And then along comes the candidate last night making these comments that have, generated a ton of headlines. Some people read them and, think that he's invoking a firing squad or calling for violence against Kamala Harris. I think it's also possible to read them as him saying, look, she should go to the worst situation in a war and see how she likes it. But certainly the Democrats are welcoming this. Their closing argument to voters, and the Harris campaign's closing argument, is we need to turn the page on the drama, on the violent rhetoric, et cetera. So this sort of plays into the message that they've been trying to make. Now, I will add that, as we've discussed on the show before, Trump is really trying to focus a message at young men. And part of his message to young men is, look, the other side, they're warmongers. They want to start wars. They're going to be sending you all into war. And, there have been people talking about a draft and so on. So this is, to me, consistent with the message he's trying to bring to that particular demographic. But with the overheated rhetoric, the violent language, I think it's completely detracting from the closing message that his campaign is trying to put out there in the swing states so close to the election. Well,
certainly his surrogates are trying very hard to tamp down any controversy around that remark, and essentially giving, as you say, the spin there that rather than a gun to Liz Cheney's head, what he's talking about is her not sending people to war. But you mentioned young men, and we've been talking about that demographic, the last few weeks now. Historically, they are less likely to vote, those a demographic. Does that hold up this time around when you have social media influencers playing such a big role in the Trump campaign?
Well, I think it's so interesting, right, that both former President Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, have spent so much time on these podcasts, going on Joe Rogan and all kinds of other shows, trying to show Donald Trump as a regular guy, right, like someone who you could hang out with, who's likable. And that seems to be resonating with a lot of male voters. However, it's unclear if those people will actually show up to vote. And in the early voting that we've seen so far, women voters and young women voters are showing up in larger numbers than expected. So it's really hard to read a lot into the early voting numbers, but certainly it's giving the Harris campaign some hope.
Gives them some hope. Talk to us then about the pressure that puts on the ground game, though, because when you look at the swing states, again, they're very tight within margins of error. How important is the ground game right now? What are you seeing in terms of ground game, trying to get voters out and making sure they don't miss Election Day?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting debate among prognosticators and pollsters whether the ground game has more impact or campaign ads. And, most people think that the ground game is important because the other side does it, and so you have to be there doing it. Now, the Democrats have more of a ground game than the Republicans. And the other interesting thing is, for years, Donald Trump has been discouraging his voters from voting early. He's doing less of that this year than last cycle. But so generally speaking, Democrats do vote more early, which is helpful because you lock in those votes, right? You don't have to worry whether they'll show up on Election Day. The question is, how many of those votes are simply cannibalizing votes they would otherwise get on Election Day? But you can be sure, Michael, that this weekend there'll be a big push on both sides, knocking on doors, trying to make sure that people get to their polling place. I know my phone has been exploding with text messages of all kinds relating to the election, and surely I'm not alone.
Yeah, and it's not just us trying to book an interview with you, I'm sure. So listen, Luiza, as we are here in this last weekend of the campaign, what are you watching out for?
I think obviously the swing states are really important, but I would also say, it's not just the presidential race, right? It's also the House and the Senate that are at stake here. And I think as we get closer to the Election Day, the presidency is still really tight. It's hard to know who will win. But most of the analysts that I talk to are expecting to see Republicans take the Senate. It'd be very hard for Democrats to win, just the way the map is this particular cycle. And the House is up for grabs. We might not know for days who wins the House, but there's some signs that Democrats have a good shot there. So it's going to be just a very interesting election. We might not know all the results for a couple days, possibly longer than that. So it's going to be a very long Tuesday night.
Okay, well, luckily, I think Politico is hosting a party here in Ottawa, so
that's right. So I hope you'll show up. I've heard that a certain U.S. ambassador might show up.
Okay, well, I'll be there, looking for you. Luiza, thank you for this. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Well, as we said at the start of our conversation, Donald Trump did use some violent language when talking about former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney. And this is how Cheney responded on X this week. Quote, "This is how dictators destroy free nations. They threaten those who speak against them with death. We cannot entrust our country and our freedom to a petty, vindictive, cruel, unstable man who wants to be a tyrant." Now, we also got some response from Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee. Take a listen.
I think that Liz Cheney is courageous and that we will always make sure that we are all fighting against and speaking out against any form of political violence.
Well, again, we are now in the last weekend of the U.S. campaign, and still there's no obvious frontrunner in this race. Take a look at where the numbers are, particularly in the swing states where observers say the presidential race will be decided. And while not everyone trusts polling numbers, especially with recent forecasts missing the mark in U.S. elections, this is where things stand right now. 7 key races, all within the margin of error when it comes to public support. Well, for some insight into the numbers ahead of U.S. Election Day, we're now joined by Andrew Smith. He is the director of the University of New Hampshire's Survey Center. Andrew Smith, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So listen, obviously we're going to be talking about polling here, but if you will, I'm hoping to start our discussion not so much with 2024, but with 2016 and 2020, because in both those elections, as you know, the polls were off. Hillary Clinton was predicted to win in 2016. There was an overestimation of the support Biden would get in 2020. First and foremost, why those misses? What happened there?
Well, actually, we're still trying to find out on some of those, but I think it comes down to a couple things. First off, more broadly, the whole polling industry is in a paradigm shift, moving from telephone surveys to web-based surveys. And I think we're still working out the kinks in some of the methodologies there. So I think that's a broadly important point to make. In 2016, the analysis of the polling after that election showed that many pollsters were not weighting by level of education. And Donald Trump did very well among people with a high school degree or maybe just some college degree, but not a graduate. And when that was taken into account, the polls became pretty close. By 2020, though, I think something very different was happening, and that's what we call partisan non-response. That is that Republicans were far less likely to be willing to talk to a pollster than were Democrats. So not only was Trump's support underestimated in 2020, but so was support of other Republican candidates down the ticket. So I think that is a difficult challenge because it's not something that we can solve with mathematical weighting. It really is, I think, a result of Donald Trump's talking for years about fake news and fake polls, and that's finally what we've got now is a difficult challenge for pollsters to actually reach those Trump supporters.
Okay, a difficult challenge, as you say. So then how much stock should people be putting into the polls right now? Because when you look at Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, they're neck and neck within the margins of error in the key swing states. So how believable are they if there are still issues to be worked out with polling?
Well, it's about the best we have. I would just be very cautious when I look at polls. I just was asked to take a look at a poll in New Hampshire today, and when looking at the methodology that was used, it makes me somewhat suspect. And one of the things that I think people can do is to not pick the poll that they want to believe because it shows their candidate winning, but to take a look at the methods that the pollsters used. The American Association for Public Opinion Research has something that they call their Transparency Initiative, which is essentially an opportunity for pollsters to show their work, to show the methods that they use, how they arrived with the conclusions that they did. And I think it really is important for not just the public, but really for journalists to look at those methods that are used to see if they are up to snuff. Now, I'm not, as I said earlier, that we're changing our methods. We're in the midst of this shift, but there are many things that should tip you off to maybe a survey that's being done pretty much on the cheap rather than one that's really trying to accurately judge the public's sentiment.
Okay, can you dig into that? What are the telltales for something that's being done on the cheap?
First of all, you should trust surveys or trust more likely to trust surveys that start with probability samples or random samples. Random sampling in what we call the central limit theorem is the only mathematical formula really that we have that allows us to infer the results back to a population from a sample. If you don't start with a random sample, you can't calculate margins of sampling error even. So random sampling, I think, is the key. The second thing is look at the source of the sample, what we call the sampling frame. If the sampling frame is from a voter registration list, I'm always a little suspect because only about 60% at best of the people who are on that registered voter list actually have contact information. So you're systematically excluding a lot of people. And then in a state like New Hampshire and many other states, you have same-day registration. So people in New Hampshire, about 10 to 15% of voters register at the polls on election day. And if you are using a poll that uses a registered voter list, you're systematically excluding those people. So I think that if you started with looking at the sampling frame and then looking at the whether or not it was a probability sample, and then most importantly, look at the actual questions that were asked as well, not just the summary of the questions, but the actual questions.
So you then, as someone who not only conducts polling and part of a polling center, but someone who gives critical thought to how they are conducted, when you look at the numbers right now between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, what is your conclusion about how close this race is?
Well, I think we have to draw a conclusion that it's fairly close with looking at a couple other factors. As you mentioned, the national polls are showing Harris up by a point to 2 points pretty much on average across the board. But that was the case back in 2020 as well and in 2016. And Trump was resulted in a much closer race than that would indicate. Some of that is something that I like to call something comes from the spiral of silence theory, that Republicans were just not willing to talk with pollsters because they were seen. They believe that their candidate is not perceived as the popular candidate by either the media or by the public. So that, if you look at that, that might give Trump an extra point or a point and a half or so that may make that gap very narrow. So again, the only way we can really figure out where the polls are, frankly, is to wait till the election is over and look retrospectively back at the methods that were used and what kind of assumptions you got. But I would go with the idea that it's a close race. And if you're a voter in the United States, presume that it's a close race and get out and vote.
Andrew Smith, interesting discussion given the numbers that we're seeing right now. I really appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thanks for having me.
And that is Primetime Politics for today. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back next week. And of course, Tuesday, we'll have special coverage of the U.S. vote. Until then, take care.